Go. Hello, hello. This is the Great Johannes speaking. I've got a big speech prepared for you today, and the main topic is going to be mass immigration, or rather, what is weird about mass immigration. They always say that, we're all immigrants and people have always been migrating, right? But modern mass migration is absolutely abnormal. Good evening, Dazo. Yeah, nice to see you again. I'm going to get right into my speech because it's going to probably take over 30 minutes anyway. And then there will be time for some interaction afterwards. All right. I'm excited about this. It is disingenuous to say that the migration of large groups of strangers into another settled society is a phenomenon of all ages. No, modern mass migration is abnormal. We've never seen this before. People have always been living as migratory groups, as nomadic pastoralists in the past, or as hunters following herds. Oh, I have to do an appeal because apparently I've been. Hold on. People are reporting me already, but it doesn't matter. I'll just continue right where I left off. No problem. People have always lived as migratory groups, as nomadic pastoralists, or as hunters following herds and seasonal fruit crops. But throughout human history and prehistory, most migrations involved small groups of relatives moving away from other families. They were not moving toward each other. That's a big difference. People simply didn't live with strangers. At most, we lived as clans of no more than 150 people, and in many cases barely 12, all of them relatives and their spouses and children. We certainly never moved into other people's yurt tents and teepees unless that was the outcome of war. There was simply no reason to impose oneself onto others, since vast and fertile unexplored lands always lay just beyond the horizon. When conflicts arose, and they often arose, either between groups of strangers vying for the same natural riches, or between groups of relatives, i.e., different sides of the family now turned into rivals, the resolution was always that one group would pack up and migrate away into uninhabited land. If one such related groups of people, a family clan for example, stumbled upon a particularly fertile strip of land, they would settle there for as long as the riches lasted. It made sense to try to protect access to these resources, such as wild herds or crop fields, from others who might find them appealing as well. Through the reproductive success of having more children, such fertile regions very quickly became overpopulated with one's own kind. It made no sense, therefore, to invite others in for the sake of diversity. Why would you surrender what you have found to others who will take it from you? Over time, the need for protection of the natural resources under one's control led to the development of the first human settlements and the earliest civilizations. Survival demanded that humans developed skill at controlling land, crops, water, shelter, animals, and even other people. Some early groups of humans specialized in capturing herds in order to domesticate them as pastoralists, usually in the more unpredictable areas of our planet where agriculture wasn't possible, such as the steppe lands of Eurasia, the Pontic steppe of Ukraine, for example, where many of our white ancestors hail from. These pastoralist races of people usually developed into aggressive warrior clans, for they had to defend their mobile assets, their cattle, which could be stolen overnight, and they had to defend it by sword in hand. Other groups of humans learned to cultivate areas of land meant for growing crops. But if you spent decades of your life removing tree stumps and rocks to make your soil more fertile, would you really surrender the fruits of your hard labor to whomever arrived at your door from faraway lands? No, you wouldn't do that. Of course not. Even agricultural peoples had to deal with thieves stealing their supplies and equipment, or their grain stores. And so agricultural societies since they produced larger but more settled populations, developed specialized standing armies protecting their lands and borders. Cities tended to start out as merchant hubs for doing trade with different peoples via land or water. Consider cities' early warehouses like Amazon, where both people and goods could be stored for trade or profit, because throughout most of human history, a lot of people were slaves. Indeed, the earliest city-states of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq and Iran and so on, regularly captured wandering hunters and gatherers from the surrounding territories in order to enslave them in sweatshops, such as in the city of Ur or Uruk, to make their captives produce clothing or apparel for wealthier, often distant customers, through the Silk Route, for example, trading with China. As sources of material wealth, city-states and their elites logically developed a need for defending their wealth. And that's why early city-states developed behind tall city walls, namely to keep their slaves in and to keep roving bands of robbers out. Soon, the competition between different merchant towns over the control of a region's shared resources and people saw the birth of larger-scale military warfare and the development of the first nation-states. As has always been the case throughout human history, cooperation didn't always make sense. If 12 people could defend their resources, they'd all live. But if 150 more arrived, they'd all starve together. There wasn't always a benefit in added numbers. Cooperation only works when resources aren't constrained, and that's why most of human history is a history of conflict and greed. The great migrations of the white Europeans since the modern colonial age still largely saw people migrating into empty lands, not into others' pre-established societies. When the Anglo-Saxons settled in Australia, they settled in the southernmost regions. That's where they built their cities, such as Canberra, Sydney, or Melbourne. But these regions were largely uninhabited by the time the Anglo got there. The darker-skinned Aboriginals of Australia were living in the hotter desert territories of the north. And mind you, Australia is about the size of the continent of Europe. The Maori people of New Zealand, for example, arrived there in New Zealand around the 13th century AD from Polynesia. They were also migrants, colonizers. The reason no one complains about this is because they were the first arrivals there. But surely they can't be racist now, can they? So anyone can join their inclusive, multicultural, open border society, right? It were the Aboriginals of Australia who later, after the whites had built their new country of Australia, which was named by the white people, started migrating into white people's farmlands. The Aboriginal incursions into white territories presented a real pest. As hunter-gatherers who hadn't domesticated any cattle, Aboriginals began killing and eating white people's farm animals. They started robbing white farmers' croplands. It was for this reason that the whites of Australia got into a conflict with the northern natives, the Aborigines, and began sterilizing them. When Dutch explorers settled along the coastlines of southern Africa's Cape for the purpose of supplying ships along this sea route from Europe to India, the Dutch settled there on empty land. The coastal regions of South Africa were indeed uninhabited by human beings. Not even the Khoisan were living there yet. The nearest people to be found were living at least 800 miles further inland. As in the case of Australia, it were the blacks who eventually migrated into the white settlements of South Africa, attracted by the lure of an easier life. The Bantu blacks of Western Africa, murdering and pillaging their way through Central Africa, later arrived to Africa's most economically prosperous zone, white South Africa. And through sheer fecundity, these Bantu blacks, who would also be shipped to the Americas as slaves, soon took over, even driving out and killing other groups of blacks. The Afrikaner people of South Africa had spent centuries building their own farms by cultivating the land. Whites hadn't stolen anything since blacks hadn't built anything. These invasive black races, the Bantu peoples of Western Africa, who also had started the black slave trade in Ghana before handing it over to the Arabs, now rule the ANC party, a communist party. They are black communists, and they have effectively stolen South Africa from the whites who built it, to the point that the white South Africans and the Afrikaners are now looking to migrate away from these black colonizers by transplanting themselves to Australia, to Russia, the USA, or perhaps even back to Europe. The story of the Americas, too, has been rewritten into a story of evil white men. Those stories insist that Europeans brought germs and viruses over to the Americas that killed off the locals. But that idea is entirely false. It didn't happen. No evidence has ever been produced proving that European germs killed the natives of the Americas. Where's the proof? In reality, the first Europeans to arrive to Latin and Central America failed to build permanent settlements there and were driven back out. They returned to Europe. The lands of the Incas, the Mayas, and the Aztecs were densely populated and well organized at the time, for indeed, the locals had established elaborate, large-scale civilizations of their own. Think, for example, of the pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica. By the 13th century, however, and we're talking about a time at least 200 years before the first Europeans set foot there, this massive civilization collapsed all on its own without any European involvement. So tell me, why did Teotihuacan collapse then if germs from Europe didn't kill them? Well, that civilization died because of overpopulation and because of its people's inability to overcome technological challenges posed to continued population growth. Come to think of it, it's similar to what we are now witnessing in Europe. We've reached our limits to growth, too. Our native populations have been seeing a numerical decline since the 1990s. If nothing is done, we Europeans will have disappeared before the end of this century, just like the people of Teotihuacan. When Europeans first arrived to Latin America, they described vast lands littered with towns and cities full of people. But when the Europeans returned a full century later, however, they found the same towns abandoned and already overgrown by plants, swallowed by the jungle. But now, because local civilization had receded, the Spanish conquistadors were able to start taking over the remnants of a lost society. The story that Europeans killed all the natives with their diseases and rifles is a fabrication of history that Southern Americans love hearing because the other story is the truth of their past, right? That is a much more shameful story of failure and mismanagement. The natives of the Americas didn't die because of Europeans. They died of starvation and due to the collapse of their own food supply. The first Europeans to arrive in North America were initially also repelled by the natives. They were the Vikings, the descendants of Eric the Red and his son Leif Erikson. Not only did their Viking crews reach Vinland, or modern-day Eastern Canada, the Viking sagas also tell of men reaching as far south as what is now presently the USA. And there is an exciting possibility that one group of Vikings lost in a storm even reached the tip of today's eastern Mexico, namely the region of Chichen Itza. There, in the Temple of Warriors, we find Mayan murals depicting a group of white-skinned men, but no women, as captives of darker-skinned men. The murals show their hands tied while being led down a street, as in a procession, to meet their fate. The final image shows a golden-skinned white man with long blonde hair stretched over backward on an altar with his feet and hands held down by two darker men, presumably to have his throat slit and his heart removed in a ritual sacrifice. The Icelandic sagas of Eric the Red furthermore tell us that at Vinland, or modern-day Canada, the Vikings encountered there an overwhelming force of resistance from the natives. They were the ancestors of the Inuit and or the Beothuk. The saga describes a great crowd of boats coming down on the Vikings like a stream. after which the Norsemen were now of opinion that, though the land might be choice and good, there would always be war and terror overhanging them from those who dwelt there before them. Wait. Don't we have a couple of words for this kind of attitude? I mean, what kind of welcoming committee is this? I mean, yes, we call it racism and xenophobia. The Native Americans were racist xenophobes who discriminated against white people, white Vikings, just because of the color of their skin. The Vikings had done nothing wrong but present the contents of their character. They initially offered to trade with the locals, but after the bull that the Vikings had brought with them scared the natives, the locals ran off and returned later for war, forcing the Vikings to run back to their ships and abandon Vinland. The natives of the Americas had initially violently forced the first modern Europeans out, and when Europeans later returned to the Americas, they arrived on bigger ships with better weapons, but also to find that the local American civilizations by that time had all but exhausted themselves naturally. Continuous conflicts and tribal warfare among the natives is what ultimately killed off the native North Americans. Europeans had nothing to do with the disappearance of the Native Americans. Besides, at their peak, before the arrival of the Europeans, North America counted about 5 to 6 million Native Americans. But guess what? Today, there are 9.2 million Native Americans living in the USA, more than ever before. And then there's this other matter, whether these Native Americans were even the original inhabitants of the Americas. It turns out that there used to be an older, more ancient people already living there, the so-called Clovis people, and their descendants who settled in northeastern America. Based on their stone-chipped tools, we now know that the Clovis people couldn't have come from Siberia as was expected. They weren't Asiatics. In fact, the first Americans were Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula of southwestern Europe, modern-day Spain and Portugal. These Europeans arrived to North America during the last ice age when water had receded by some 200 feet and an ice path or an ice bridge was formed along Iceland and Greenland between Europe and North America, allowing for people on foot and by boat to make the passage. These Iberian peoples were originally North Europeans who had been forced south to escape the ice age that now covered Europe halfway through today's France. And these Europeans were the first inhabitants of the Americas. But they were brutally and savagely eradicated to the last man standing by bloodthirsty Asiatics from Siberia, the so-called Native Americans that we now know today. The American Clovis people, or actually European American Clovis people, and their descendants were genocided. Coincidentally, other Asiatics would later also exterminate the Viking settlers of southern Greenland. The idea that only white men went around the world colonizing, genociding, and crusading is, of course, a historically laughable piece of nonsense. European people have been genocided more often by others than the other way around. I wonder, though, how come there are no memorials to the genocide of these ancient Europeans who once settled the Americas long before the Sioux, the Apache, and the Comanche ever even existed? Even before the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayas existed. Technically speaking, if we follow the arguments of all the brown people living among us today, it means that the Americas belong to the Europeans, since we were there first. We didn't steal their land. They stole it from us. What all these indigenous movements can do, we can do. We can say to the descendants of the Sioux and the Mayans, you are living on stolen land. The modern Europeans, i.e., upon our great and long-awaited return home, also introduced horses now to the Americas for transportation, and soon started building railroads and waterways to connect agricultural lands with the bustling new cities. When Native Americans began attacking these European settlements, such as on the island of Manhattan, they responded by building Wall Street, named so because it was a wall meant to keep the warlike Indians out of civilized society. Now let's for a moment appreciate all the different times other races attempted to invade Europe before Europeans ever even became colonizers. I mean, were it not the Arabs who, after they conquered all of North Africa during the 7th century, which used to be a region of Mediterranean white people, by the way, set their sights on Europe? Did these Arabs not invade and conquer Spain and Rome and then attempted to take France as well? In the year 732 AD, the Frankish armies led by Charles Martel beat back the Umayyad legions, preventing the Islamization of Western Europe. And likewise, the Albanian warlord Skanderbeg, once abducted by Ottoman Muslims from Turkey and raised as one of them, converted back to Christianity after his escape, reunited with his people, and with the help of his natives, he delayed the Ottoman incursion into Europe long enough to allow other forces, such as the Venetian forces, to gear up for battle and protect Europe. The Ottomans had colonized Bulgaria for over 500 years, Hungary for over 150, and parts of Greece even to this day. Twice did the Ottomans attempt to take Vienna, the city, the capital of Austria, a strategic city located along the Danube, namely at the Siege of Vienna in 1529 and at the Battle of Vienna in 1683. By the way, that's what this painting in the background is all about. It's the Battle of Vienna, 1683. The Ottoman Turks against the European alliance, really, saved by the Poles. John Sobieski. During the mid-13th century, the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan made their way into present-day Poland, raping Christian women and pillaging Christian lands, leaving nothing but terror and devastation. Look, if we Europeans are always called colonizers because we build countries like Australia and the USA, then what do we call those people who only care to destroy Europe? Savages. It wasn't even until the 19th century that large groups of Northern Europeans, especially Germans, sailed out in large numbers to the USA to become its largest immigrant group after the Anglo had settled there first, taking over from the Dutch. When these modern Europeans moved to the USA, they weren't immigrants. We always have this question like, are they immigrants or are they settlers? What are we? They're neither. They weren't even settlers. They were transplants. For when a people of the same race or of a similar culture move into each other's settled territories, they don't arrive as invaders or colonizers or expats or migrants. They are moving between two regions occupied by their own people, the way a strawberry plant sometimes clones itself by turning one of its branches into a new set of roots. Moreover, most European émigrés, transplants, to Australia, South Africa, USA, New Zealand, Canada, were Protestant Christians trying to escape the Catholic Church and its armies, which technically made them the first religious refugees ever to arrive in those territories. How very different are the modern migrations of people coming to us from primitive, backward places. Modern mass migration is totally incomparable. For example, with the arrival of the British to India. The British never engulfed India with white offspring. Rather, the British took over the Indian leadership, as the Spanish conquistadors did in Latin America. And so they ended up improving India's economic outlook to the benefit of all who lived there. The idea that India's so-called 5,000-year-old civilization was somehow the wealthiest place on earth before Europeans arrived comes from this misunderstanding that 100 million subsistence farmers were once living there in India. But they produced nothing of value and exported nothing to the world. Even though they were right along the Silk Road, they didn't trade. Both pre-colonial India and China may have had the largest human populations at their time, but individually, people were so poor that their states could hardly tax them. Europeans achieved more in just the past 500 years than both India and China have done in 5,000. I know that's painful to hear, especially since feelings of shame so harshly affect these people. But it's the truth. Although Europe had a relatively small population compared to Indochina, feudal Europe generated more taxes and was thus able to muster up a greater conquering force by investing in technology. Also, Europeans never colonized China. And why not? Well, China was just as densely populated as India, I suppose, but still better organized and more developed. The Chinese were, in the end, able to ward off European conquerors. You can't migrate into populated land. Nowadays, we would call the Chinese racist for not allowing us in, right? So that brings me to a discussion of the weirdness of modern mass migration. Looking at the USA and Canada, the arrival of hordes of Indians, Latinos, Arabs, and Africans resembles the collapse of Native American civilization centuries earlier. It's the same for Europe, where now hordes of Indians, Muslims, Arabs, and Central Africans appear to be flooding the welfare programs and the kindergartens, if not also the public pools. What's going on here? Like, why aren't Europeans and white Americans fighting back against their tormentors? Is it because Westerners somehow can't muster up the force to fight back anymore? In this world, you only get what you can conquer, and you only keep what you can defend. Or are we white people somehow dying of the foreigners' diseases and their germs? No, we're not. Clearly, what is happening to the West today is a tale of a dying, dwindling civilization that, because of its weight, of its internal collapse, its own complexity, and its loss of competence and skill, can no longer defend itself against the newcomers, just as the American natives once could no longer repel modern Europeans. Except, there's a twist. Europeans arriving to the Americas brought with them a superior civilization, superior technology, and advances in many other fields. But the hordes now taking over North America and Europe don't even bother using paper to wipe their hands or can't even use cutlery. Above all, they appear to be arriving in inflatable dinghies provided to them by the United Nations, if not by the Soros Open Society. They wouldn't even have made the trip across alive without our help. It's laughable. This is surely strange. Like, is it really the first time in human history that a people has voluntarily invited its own replacement? No, it's not the first time. It happened to Spain right before the Islamic conquest, when certain merchants began inviting Muslim conquerors into the Spanish city gates, then still ruled by the Gothic Germanic peoples. When it became clear what was happening in the year 722 AD, when the Battle of Covadonga started, and a man named Peleo started the Christian reconquest of the peninsula by establishing the Kingdom of Asturias. A point of note here is that it took approximately 781 years to complete the Reconquista and drive the Muslims back out. That's what happens when you allow a subversive strand of people to take in your enemies. The modern world, built by Europeans, is fading. And when the blacks stole South Africa from Afrikaner rule, they made it worse. When the British seized India, they made it better. When the Europeans arrived to Australia, they introduced civilization. But when the Indians and the Pakistani take over England, England will fall. If we allow cousin-marrying foreigners to overrun our lands, we will be thrown back to the level of subsistence farming, barely getting by, living among the ruins of our ancestral glory. Our cities are at risk of fading away, like the pyramids of Latin America. Once centers of power and wealth, soon relics of times forgotten. What Soros, the Open Society, and others are doing to the West could take 1,000 years to undo. But perhaps, for those who are impatient like me, there's another way. A trick. Meanwhile, white European people are turning their backs on the cities their forebears once built. In fact, both leftist and right-wing middle-class people are leaving the diverse cities at similar rates. Politics doesn't matter. They are migrating away from the diverse centers and settling in the still pleasant suburbs, or moving closer to nature, to the countryside, or even going off the grid. The modern migrant forcing his way into the white man's house may feel entitled to what he didn't build and could never have built on his own. White people, however, shall have the last laugh. As we prepare to improve our lives in ways others cannot, we are once again the avant-garde, the forefront, the first to leave a failing civilization behind, to turn our backs on the machinations and regimentations of an oversaturated economic system, to free ourselves once again to begin exploring the world. We've learned our lessons. They always say we should learn from history, and we have. We'll never share our civilization with strangers again. Take, for example, the words of one so-called black professor from Canada, Ben Philippe, who published a novel in 2021 called Charming as a Verb, in which he wrote, "When this race war hits its crescendo, I'll gather all you white people into a beautifully decorated room under the pretense of unity. I'll give you a speech to civility and all the good times we share. I'll smile as we raise glasses to your good, white health, while the detonator blinks under the table, knowing the exits are locked and the air vents filled with gas. They want you dead. They want all of you dead." This novel was advertised as exploring the complexities of being a black teenager. I can only assume part of those complexities involves suffering from psychopathy. It wouldn't surprise me, though, at all, that underneath their thick skins, all minority think exactly like this. Author Ben Philippe merely revealed the friendly mask minorities wear around us. As soon as they win power, when they are the majority, electorally and forcibly, their masks will slip. As with the Clovis people of the Americas and with the Vikings of Greenland, they will murder us all. It would be wrong, though, to call these minorities racist, for that is a big person's word that eludes their tribal mindset. Black and brown people live as clans of family members, just as the primitive family clans of prehistory. This is why such large numbers of them, after all, marry their first cousins, from 30% of marriages in Turkey up to 70% of marriages in Pakistan. They do so in order to avoid having to live with strangers, to avoid having to share their wealth with outsiders. While they may say that some European royalty also used to marry their cousins, the difference is that European people condemned it and shunned the practice. Europeans already avoided cousin marriages before Catholicism came along. And before you say anything more, compare that Pakistani 70% to just 0.2% of the citizens of Alabama. Pakistani people are 350 times as likely to marry their first cousins as someone from Alabama. How did anyone think that such people could be made compatible with our society of equality? They have no such concept. See, the reason non-whites call us racist so often and so easily is because white people tend to extend their love to perfect strangers of their own race and even to strangers of another race. It is this act of kindness that truly elicits a disturbing sense of murderous envy among non-whites. The tribal man could never conceive of helping others outside of his own immediate family. The idea of digging a water well, for example, to help other people seems an almost incomprehensible act to them, as though it were murder. A black man living in the USA, for example, might feel genuinely racially discriminated against whenever white people donate money to help other black Africans living in Africa, because the African American man will be wondering why he didn't get any money. See, those racist white people passed him over. That's why they hate us, because we are too kind. But we won't ever have to be so kind again. Those days are over. If I may paraphrase, exploring the complexities of growing up as a white in a multicultural society such as the Netherlands, I would, per the words of Ben Philippe, say, gather all the non-whites in our beautifully decorated cities under the pretense of equality. I'd hand them over all of our wealth and the keys to all of our homes. I'd even throw in some prostitutes to keep the men busy while the subway trains loaded with thermonuclear bombs ride into town quietly and unseen, knowing my fellow white people have already left the cities and the roads and bridges leading out have been sabotaged. I mean, all this in a literary sense, of course, for I would never think of doing something like this. Are you crazy? But then again, our dwindling white birth rates may prove a benefit. The people with the larger numbers will forever be condemned to living in the most dystopian cities, shitholes. And those cities will always be at risk of blowing themselves and everyone in them to pieces. I'm just saying, I think we're going to be fine. Whatever happens next, one thing is for sure. White people's future lies outside city walls. Even in case of a nuclear apocalypse, we could just reconvene on the steplands of Eurasia or on the plains of North America, where we belong, and live happily ever after. Thank you very much. That was an amazing speech. I just need to reorganize my stuff here. All right. I see a lot of people have been listening, and I enjoy that very much. And I hope we can have a little bit more of interactive discussion now. Thank you for the hand hearts. What's that for? Okay. I didn't see the new group in Canada. Yeah. Tell me about it. I will be posting this speech as usual to my jmk.info website so you can review the whole thing. And I'll be posting a copy also to @JohannesMK, at the Great Johannes. Wait, I'll just show you my links on here. Substack is the most important one, jmk.info. And you can connect to me on Rumble nowadays at JohannesMK, Instagram, YouTube, X, JohannesMKX. Okay. Fantastic. I'm doing amazing. Yeah. I'm going to specialize in doing speeches like this because I feel although I might not have a million-man audience yet, one day, soon, I'll get really good at doing speeches and people will listen. People will find them, right? All right, I'll remove the links for a moment. Was a bit of an unsettling start because right at the start, my live was reported and I had to appeal it while I was already doing my speech. So that was a bit of a false start, but anyway. Yeah, you like the new format. Yeah, I want my talks to have meaning and weight. And the best way to do that is just to prepare a good speech. Now, this was a particularly long one, 30 minutes for a live stream. Maybe it could be 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, right? And the issue is I should start with like a meaningful thing that we can then have a discussion about. So as you've noticed in my speech, I've kind of reframed history. I didn't falsify history. I didn't rewrite it. I simply reframed it. There's a story that is true that in Greenland, in the southern part of it, you have these Viking settlers of Greenland. By the 14th century or so, they were Christian. They had a little church there. They were pastoralists. They had cattle. And in the north, further north, you have these Inuit peoples. And at some point, the Vikings completely disappeared. Apparently, they either died out of starvation or they were attacked by the Northerners. Now, there's a debate about that, about how that might have happened. Did they wage a war? Did they have a conflict? But the truth is, we know for sure that the Inuit are still there. And where did the Vikings go? I say they were genocided. Prove me otherwise. All right, the pre-Moor Spain, yeah. This is a true story of this guy named Peleo or Pelagius, if you want to have the Latin name. Peleo Cordovanga. Sorry, these names are a bit, but Peleo, yeah. They figured out that basically Jewish merchants had let the Muslims in, and that's how they were taken over from within. And so they had to start fighting back, basically city by city, region by region, and it took them 8 centuries to do it. But they did do it. It's just that, do we now, in our time, really want to wait 1,000 years before we get to reconquer Europe? No, we've got to do something else. That's why I told you of this trick. We've got to mess with history a little bit and cheat history to get ourselves back on top very rapidly with a very interesting, ingenious little thing. I think that thing is an almost natural collapse of all the big cities in the Western world, but not to our detriment, but to our benefit. We will get to start over. Using the energy of the collapse, right? We can start over with what is really important. Do you care about I love paintings, for example, but is it really more important to have the paintings or to have a healthy people? I hope everyone agrees. The preference is to have a healthy people, strong, heroic, virile, fertile. That's more important because then they can make new paintings, right? We're not going to sacrifice ourselves to save the economy. we might have to sacrifice the economy to save ourselves, and why wouldn't we do that? If it were necessary, that's what you would do. It's the decision you'd make, right? That's the whole point of being an ethno-nationalist. You just care more about your own people than about stuff. Because the people will acquire what was lost. The material world is an addition to the spiritual world, not the primary world. The spiritual world is the primary world. Everything else is an addition that you can use to explore your spiritual life, so to speak, right? But to fall for the trap of materialism, I think it's wrong. Because in the end, if you make your whole life just about material wealth, you will notice that you will perish along with the material stuff. Whereas if you make your life about growing spiritually, you might end up living forever and for all eternity in heaven, right? All right. Is the Netherlands really one of the best countries in Europe? I don't know, man. I think it's a pretty feminist, feeble place. Yeah. Those thoughts on the UK riots. Yes, I've seen some on Epping, right? It's like last year in Southport. I hope now people have learned not to get arrested, because it's really nasty if you go to jail for 4 years just for saying the wrong things on Twitter or Facebook or so. I keep saying Twitter. I know it's X, but you know, the only matter that matters is land and people. Yeah. Right. How did we get to this point? Brainwashing, propaganda. We've been foozled and befuzzled and bamboozled by people who make you believe that the whole world is your family, so you don't have to have children anymore. Just let other people's children into your country. It's a great stunt, but you know, I mean, I mentioned this. We always are told to learn from history, right? So you have the Trojan horse story. Let's learn from that story. Let's learn also from Pelayo in Spain, right? We know, we can see right now, we're aware of it. Thanks to the internet, we've been able to figure this out on our own without our elites even telling us anything. We figured this out. We're being replaced with mass immigration. It's being organized by the top corporations and the top World Economic Forum and the Yehuden merchants, right? They're doing this to us out of rancor, out of revenge, out of hatred. But in the end, they're going to kill us all unless we fight back. And that's why I'm here. We're going to fight back. What about the argument that if we can be brainwashed, then why shouldn't we be? Well, that's why we have a morality. We used to have a religious morality that, believe it or not, used to protect people from the brainwashing of every other party. We can return to this. We need to basically immunize ourselves mentally and basically immunize the normies mentally, right? And prevent them from falling for every other stunt after the other. Meaning that, imagine you could make people so religious again that they'll turn off the TV and quit watching Netflix. That would be an interesting goal, and it shouldn't be impossible to reach. All right? You finally caught the live stream. You've been catching up on YouTube. Wow, okay, yeah. I put all my videos up on YouTube, but also on Rumble now. Rumble/JohannesMK. I got over like 250 videos or so, 230 or so. Live streams, podcasts, and an older podcast that used to be called the Johannes Tyrannus series. But yeah, I'm glad people are watching my stuff. So that motivates me to make sure that I make each episode worthwhile by starting it with an interesting speech, right? That gets people to think about things, right? Do you think Europe will have to fight with Africa? It's certainly possible. Under the leadership of Russia and China, they might send, for example, Nigerians or Ethiopians to fight Europe. And the way to deal with that, they would outnumber us. The foot soldiers would outnumber us. But the way to deal with that is to freeze them in the winter, to use the winter. This, by the way, did you know that this is how at Poitiers and at Tours, the Battle of Tours, when Charles Martel defeated the Umayyad, they used the winter cold. Basically, the Muslim fighters, they weren't just fighting the Frankish armies. The Frankish had Father Winter in their backs. And at some point, the Umayyad Muslims, they hadn't brought proper clothing for the winter, and they simply got too cold and they couldn't win. That's how they lost. So we have to use the environment and the territory against our enemies. But by territory, I mean all of Europe is the territory. So we've got the Alps and we've got other places, features that we will have to use in the future to defend ourselves. Yeah, we got bombs, right? A better idea would simply be to lure them into our cities, all right, and then cut off the water supply or something, right? Do a stunt like that, a trick, an ambush. Right. The cities won't survive without food supply from the countryside. And if we control the countryside, so that's crucial that we remain in charge of the countryside. Yeah? What do you think of tech bros like Peter Thiel? I think Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are sort of techno-communists. They certainly do not care about white people and our survival. They do care about exploiting all of humanity for profit. So Elon Musk, for example, he loves India because he needs to start selling Teslas to the Indians in India. Right? So his loyalties are globalistic and not constrained to white people. He doesn't really care. He just knows that white people happen to have a lot of wealth. The white middle class is wealthy worldwide. And so he knows he needs to appease us a little bit to get our money. But if I were you, I would not purchase any Tesla products. No, I wouldn't do it. Thoughts on the Epstein files? I think for sure Donald Trump was one of the best friends of Jeffrey Epstein, and they certainly he messed around. I don't know what he did, but he's definitely. I don't support Trump anymore. I think Trump is, someone called him President Pedo, but I don't know if that's too far or too much. But I don't want leaders like this anymore. The compromised leaders who are controlled by foreign. The Mossad has the videos of Trump and the girls. I mean, this isn't something that is easy to forget about. We're dealing with an entire political system that is under the control of foreign agencies. It shouldn't be that way. If anything, it should be the other way around. We should have dirt on Netanyahu. We should have his videos. What did Ehud Barak and Netanyahu do? We need their videos. That's how it should be. The way it is now, it's they've got us by the balls, literally. All right. Do you think Nigerians are never EU enemies? Right? No, it doesn't matter whether they are conservative or not. It's like saying, oh, we have a black pope, but he's conservative. No, I don't want that crap. I don't want Kanye West as my president or something. I don't want that crap. I don't want Kemi Badenoch as the leader of the conservatives in the UK. This is nonsense. If you can't even defend your own people, what can you defend? You can't defend anything at all. It's pathetic. Would you recommend getting proficient with a bow and arrows? Absolutely, yeah. And learn to make your own crossbows too. Even better, learn to carve your own bows. Learn to make them yourself with, say, nothing but a pocket knife. How would you do that? All right? Because one day you might need that skill. You'll be driven into the woods to starve you or something, right? When whatever there's some red army comes across, and if you know how to make a bow with, I don't know, not even a pocket knife, but a chipped stone that is sharp enough, right? Could you do it that way? Then you're dangerous, man. Then you're really dangerous. Any thoughts on how we should prepare for the hard times ahead? So study the survival manuals. The SAS manual is really great, right? SAS survival guide. I used to own a copy of it when I was a child. And there's others you can keep on your phone as well. But yeah, learn a little bit of that off-the-grid stuff, the autonomy stuff. Make yourself less dependent on the government. Not necessarily today, but acquire the skill set necessary to be more independent if that were necessary. Make yourself ungovernable. Make yourself dangerous. So something basic like, do you even know how to make a fire? With what you can find outside. Could you go outside to the woods and find any materials that help you make a fire? Turns out that's actually very difficult, so you're going to have to figure this out. Of course, you would like to have matches and you would like to have lighters, but if you don't even have that, how would you make a fire? At least you need to know how to do it. Right? And other things like, basic things like growing crops, or knowing at least the basics of what wild plants and animals can you actually eat without poisoning yourself. Basic understanding, right? Basic stuff. If we start focusing on these things, the bushcraft stuff, the off-the-grid stuff, that's why I love the Outdoor Boys guy so much. Nicholson, right? Nichols, yeah. That was That was awesome. But you know why those outdoor off the grid videos are so popular on YouTube? Because middle class white people, they dream of getting the fuck out of these cities and these stupid corporations. We don't want to do this life anymore. This isn't for us anymore. We want to wake up our spirits, our soul, right? And feel what it means to be alive again by getting the hell out of here. That's my idea. Learn survival crafts, yeah. And connect with trustworthy people in your territory. Wow, what the hell is that? Facts, you hate it here. Yeah, see, you're not the only one. There's a lot of people, they go along with the 9 to 5, live to work thing, right? But we don't want to do that anymore. We want to live. We want to live to, it's not even a matter of live to work or work to live. No, I want to live to live. Leave me alone. I want to work. I want to live to live. And that maybe can be achieved if you allow some more excitement into your life, a brush with death. I said a brush, right? You're not going to kill yourself, but a brush with death, right? And face insurmountable setback that you think you can't possibly deal with it, and you're going to deal with it anyway. Things like that. Right? Do you think the Israel conflict will be the downfall of America and the West? Potentially, yes. If we lose Israel, that means we also, the West, or at least USA and Britain, then lose control of important trade routes. And that could be very problematic to the West. Yeah. That doesn't mean I support Zionism. If you ask me what is your final solution, my final solution is we turn the whole Middle East into a Christian zone. So basically new crusades and take over. Have you seen these thugs of Jolani, the new president of Syria? They've been throwing people off of rooftops and so on. Right? I don't approve of that at all. That kind of nonsense needs to end. It needs to die out. We want to have a peaceful Middle East, and that means we make it Christian. Right, no purpose in working when it doesn't benefit in the end. Yeah, a lot of people feel exactly that way. Why are you still paying taxes when all that money is spent on diversity and mosques and so on, immigration? They get basically you're funding free housing for Ali, Ahmed, and their 27 children, right? Cousin marriage, of course, right? And you can't afford a house. You can't even afford rent. What's the point of living if you're only working to make money and then you get a few hours off and you're exhausted? You don't want to do anything anymore, right? It can't be like that anymore. Ultimate goal of mass migration agenda in Western Europe is plainly to erase us, to replace us with more simpler consumers. I would say more obedient, simpler consumers who will just work hard and buy a lot of stuff. And that's it. Basically just cattle. They just want consumer cattle. They don't want people like us who still want to live. Yeah, taxes are funding immigrants, yeah. Because the white middle class has money, so you can tax them, and you can use that money to realize your far left communist dreams. All right. So I missed your comments from the start of the show when I was talking and when I was doing the speech the whole time. All right. Indian skin is brown for all I care. Yeah? It's not just a handful of haters here and there, right? No. Boo-hoo. Africa needs diversity too, yeah. All right. All right, I'm gonna clock off here, end the show here. And I'll be back tomorrow with another speech. And also on Wednesday and Thursday, 4 nights a week, I'm going to do the regular program so that people will know, oh yeah, he's live again, he's live again. Hopefully that will build up a bit more of a following. And by the way, you can always watch the replays. go to my links here. I got my Substack. That's my main website, jmk.info. You'll find my videos there and articles, and you can subscribe. You can donate a little bit to keep me alive, help me pay rent or something. And then YouTube is pretty active. My X account is active, and I put all my videos on Rumble as well at JohannesMK. So I hope you have a great evening. Yeah, you'll be there tomorrow. Okay, great, man. Then I'll see you there. All right.